everyone at Oakland Rotary for having me. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe and relatively sane, and bonus points if you're making sourdough or perfecting your Negroni recipe, finishing your screenplays and manuscripts, or just managing to stay present. But tonight we are going to talk about restaurants and the future of the industry. And I wanted to begin with what we know now about restaurants. If we could go to slide 1. Perfect. So just for context, I wanted to begin with what the restaurant industry looked like pre-COVID, though most things back then are difficult to imagine. The restaurant industry, particularly here in the Bay Area, was by no means an easy sector to generate revenue, to stay afloat in, particularly given things like high labor, rent, and insurance costs. It was pretty cutthroat. Nevertheless, the economy was doing well, which translated to greater prospects for consumer spending on food outside of the home. And the industry was adding jobs to the economy. So in 2019, the National Restaurant Association projected that by 2029, restaurant and food service jobs in California would grow by 9%. So in other words, restaurant jobs in California would grow from 1.83 million to 1.99 million. And according to the California Restaurant Association, the state's restaurant industry generated $7 billion in sales tax alone. Now, the economic outlook for the restaurant industry, as you can imagine, is very different. In a word, I might say it would be bleak. According now to the California Restaurant Association, 20 to 30% of the state's restaurants could close permanently as a result of statewide public health measures enacted in response to COVID-19. And that dire figure even assumes support from the initial stimulus bill that was enacted in March by the federal government. And so we can imagine the extent of closures would represent a substantial hit to the California economy. And one question I've asked myself in recent weeks is, why were restaurants hit so hard? And I think in large part that calls back to the structural difficulties of running a restaurant, which again is low margins, tight cash flows, high rents, equipment costs, and labor costs. We know now that county health orders govern carry out and delivery operations, which have been deemed essential businesses. And the guidelines in place here in Oakland for Alameda County are substantively similar to those effective in Contra Costa, Marin, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara, as well as the city of Berkeley, which operates its own Department of Public Health. These guidelines require restaurants, as well as grocery and food stores, to post social distancing protocols. So you may by now have seen these requirements imposed at essential businesses that are required to inform employees and customers that they should, for instance, not come in if they have a cough or a fever, maintain a minimum of 6 feet distance from other people. If you're sneezing and coughing, it must be into a cloth or tissue or into one's elbow. And of course, do not engage in shaking hands or any unnecessary physical contact. At this stage, there is no timeline that's been given by the government for reopening. Of course, there have been reports that the current shelter-in-place orders will be extended through the end of May. On April 22nd, there were reports that Governor Newsom discussed a quote clarity of indicators that pointed perhaps toward a limited summertime reopening of certain non-essential business activities, including dining at restaurants. But one hurdle is the lack of availability of personal protective equipment for workers inside businesses. And so that may cause a delay to an eventual reopening. And we also know that even when shelter-in-place restrictions are lifted, we can expect additional safety precautions. So things like masks, distance tables, disposable menus, temperature checks, reduced occupancy and staff, and reducing occupancy can also mean, depending on the restaurant, that the restaurant has to undertake renovations, even absent renovations, which again costs money. The restaurant will have fewer patrons coming in and fewer covers means reduced profits. So that isn't great in an industry where cash flow is very important. There were several all the questions that were submitted to this talk were really fantastic, but in particular, there were great questions about what restaurants are going to look like when dining rooms do reopen, and how are folks going to even eat when they have to wear masks. And I think our best indication at this stage is what dining spaces in other cities look like, where shelter-in-place orders have been lifted. So for instance, Georgia, where dine-in service resumed yesterday, according to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the restaurants are now required to adhere to 39 guidelines, including screening employees for signs of illness, requiring all staffers to wear face coverings at all times, and limiting capacity to no more than 10 patrons per 500 square feet. Tennessee also reopened yesterday, and under that state's plan, restaurants are asked to require employees to wear gloves and masks, use disposable menus, have a maximum of 6 people per table, and limit overall occupancy to 50% capacity. Texas is expected to allow dine-in service to resume this Friday, and dining rooms there will be limited to 25% of their normal occupancy. So let's say you have a max occupancy of 50 people, that would mean only a dozen people can actually eat on premises. This raises many questions. What is, for instance, a dining experience like when you can't see the server's face? I think a lot of human interaction is based on inference, and so that's going to be difficult. It's definitely going to be a different dining situation. And if, for instance, you've gone out and you've ordered coffee, as I have during this time, it's pretty difficult to communicate with a mask on. So it won't necessarily be the kind of hospitality experience that I think we come to expect when we dine out. In Hong Kong, International had an interesting in-depth feature on what is being required there, including temperature checks at the door. And it sounds like, for the person who asked about how to eat with the mask, it sounds like you can rest your mask in your lap for the time that you are consuming food, which makes sense. Even if it's an imperfect solution. Diners there are also being asked to fill out a form in an effort to perform what's called contact tracing. So when you come into a restaurant in Hong Kong, you're asked for your name, you're asked for your contact information. So if there is a breakout, you can be timely informed. And those protective measures call to my mind the picture on this slide, which again comes courtesy of Berkeleyside. It is a cashier at Liability Bodega up here on Piedmont Avenue. They have fantastic pasta, and this particular woman, she used to serve at the restaurant in Rockridge, and she has since been shifted to kind of a part-time 20-hour work week at the carry-out shop. And in the words of one of the attendees of this conversation, a question was sort of, is this the new normal? And I do very much think the answer to that is yes, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we progress, but I think that takeout will continue even as dine-in service resumes, as we've seen in places like Georgia. Even though people can technically eat in a restaurant, they're hesitant because they're worried that there will still be transmission. Lastly, for this slide, large event cancellations, I think are going to continue to have a big impact on the dining economy. Even when restaurants reopen, if larger gatherings are still prohibited, that can have unanticipated consequences on business. For instance, in San Francisco, there was no outside lands, the city's Pride event was canceled, and even going forward shows that the Fox and the Paramount have a pretty substantial impact, at least in my anecdotal experience. I worked at Hopscotch in Uptown for a good bit, and I mean, I noticed a substantial difference in covers the nights that there were shows and the nights that there weren't. And so I do think that that will take a toll on the economy even as dine-in service resumes. Next slide, please. Okay, great. How are restaurants coping? So we know that restaurants have been pivoting to takeout and delivery. Even restaurants that were closed initially are now reopening with limited or takeout friendly menus. Oftentimes they needed some time to recalibrate what they were serving. perhaps also by reducing the number of different items, then they actually don't need as much staff, and they don't need to have people in the facility for as much time preparing food. I just want to shout out Berkeleyside here because Sarah, who's my editor there, has compiled and with the rest of the Berkeleyside team a really fantastic tracker, COVID-19 tracker that keeps pace with all of the openings, closings. And so from there, I've learned about Polara Pizza, Mama Oakland, and Sidebar, which were initially closed and have since reopened during this time. You know, the takeout and delivery trend is, of course, not limited to restaurants. Grab-and-go cocktails are, I think, one of the things to come out of this crisis that we didn't see before, in part because of regulations that prohibited those practices that were since loosened. Yeah, you know, just walking down Grand Avenue, I have seen the Libertine and Shakewell really, I think, benefiting at least from that kind of component of their business. We've also seen restaurants cope, you know, by shutting down temporarily. There have, of course, also have been permanent closures. So with respect to temporary closures, you know, there are owners who don't want to hire staff to come in. They know, for instance, that their workers will make you know, make some money, perhaps an equal amount of money by qualifying for unemployment, and they don't want to put their employees in danger. Sometimes they can't afford to keep their employees on payroll. And so, you know, Fish and Bird in Berkeley is one example of a company that posted publicly, due to the ambiguity over transmission, they felt it was better to remain closed. You know, there was also a question we received about food waste, and I thought it related pretty intimately to closures. The question was, has food waste increased or decreased as a result of COVID? And at least initially, there was, you know, a tremendous spoilage because of disruption to normal dining operations, perishable products, for instance, eggs, milk, produce, and not just from restaurants, but also the closure of hotels and technology cafeterias. For a story I reported for Eater San Francisco, I spoke with one of the heads of an organization called Food Runners, which is a San Francisco-based nonprofit that takes leftover food and delivers it to people in need. And they said they had just been slammed with restaurants offloading extra food, and also tech cafeterias, because, you know, places like Google and even their San Francisco satellite office and LinkedIn, they just have food sort of on every floor that, you know, could have gone to waste when work from home orders went out. And so the bright side is that there are organizations like Food Runners that can then repurpose a lot of this food. Of course, that's not a foolproof mechanism, and there was waste. National Geographic also has reported spoilage in fields because of, you know, farmers are unable to shift their suppliers on a dime, which was certainly true at the beginning of this crisis. There have also been permanent closures, unfortunately, here in Oakland. Benchmark in downtown and Camberger also in downtown closed. You know, age has not been a constraint on closings. The picture here is of Tartine Bakery, which was open in Berkeley for just 7 months. And on the flip side, Berkeleyside reported on Monday that 35-year-old Laleem's has also shuttered permanently. That was in Berkeley. 4 coffee shops here in Oakland have closed since the onset of the crisis. Bika Coffee House in Rockridge, Tertulia Coffee, which was a personal favorite of mine here in Uptown, Black Spring Coffee, and Gaylord's Cafe up on Piedmont Avenue. So reducing staff hours and layoffs is another way that restaurants have been able to cope by reducing payroll. So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in March, employment in leisure and hospitality fell by 459,000 jobs. Most of that decline occurred in food services and drinking places, and that decline offset gains over the previous 2 years. So that was a really substantial drop. The brighter note, to the extent there is one, is that employment benefits are now, according to Politico, on average $970 per week nationally, which is actually nearly double the average weekly pay for full-time food industry workers on a nationwide basis, and that was $500. So, and there are some workers who are making more as a result of unemployment than they were when they were, working at their food industry jobs. The rise in unemployment benefits, why they're so high right now, is due to a $600 sweetener that is guaranteed by the federal government until July 31. So it remains to be seen what will happen after that stage. But for now, unemployment, for those who can qualify, is a stopgap. Fundraising campaigns and merchandise and gift cards are another way that restaurants have been able to cope. I think, beyond, outlets like Berkeleyside, I think a great way to keep track of this is Instagram. GoFundMes, Kickstarter campaigns for staff, gift cards, merchandise. I have purchased my gift card that I plan to use the night, hopefully when we can return to restaurants, presuming people are feeling safe, and that's to Sister here on Grand Avenue, which was the last place actually my husband and I were able to eat before we weren't able to go out anymore. So that'll be our kind of grand re-entry into the world. I wanted to talk briefly about the role of government relief for businesses and workers, and there are two levels, and some of the attendees as business owners on this call may very well know more about this than I do, so I would welcome, of course, you to chime in at the end of this with anything you'd like to share. But at the state level, there has been an increase in sick leave pay for food store, farm and delivery workers, and a $125 million package for undocumented workers who are ineligible for unemployment insurance benefits and disaster relief due to their immigration status. At the federal level, there's been the Paycheck Protection Program, which has already been mentioned on this call, and that is small business aid. Congress authorized an initial $350 billion in late March, and these are low interest loans that can be forgiven if certain requirements are met. At least within the service industry, there was a lot of controversy that met this program when it was initially rolled out for a few reasons. The first being that the money dried up within a matter of 2 weeks, and 300 million of that initial $350 million went to big chains, at least 75 publicly traded companies, so places like Potbelly, Ruth Chris Steakhouse, and Taco Cabana, and there was such a backlash that, most notably Shake Shack gave back their $10 million, and because really the intent behind the law was to give supposedly was to give small business owners a leg up. Unfortunately, many didn't get that because they weren't allocated any funding. The other reasons why the program was somewhat controversial was because of the qualifications for loan forgiveness. So one condition was that restaurants must retain or hire 100% of staff by the end of June. The problem is that might not be economically desirable or feasible. For instance, especially if you're opening at half capacity, you're probably not going to rehire all of the staff you had when you were operating at what was your max capacity. And so that's an issue. Another issue is that 75% of the loaned money must be spent on payroll, but paying employees, if they're not coming into work, could actually be worse for workers because then they're not qualifying for unemployment. And again, there's the omnipresent health and safety consideration. Do you want your employees coming in when they could be making unemployment and staying home in quarantine? With respect to the money drying up, last Thursday, there was actually another $310 billion that was allocated to replenish the fund. So, there will be another shot for many businesses to the extent that they are interested in those kinds of loans. Okay, next slide, please. So we got quite a few really terrific related questions with respect to the practicalities and also perhaps some of the ethical implications of carrying out during the current crisis. And I thought I'd answer those questions here. So one of the questions that we received was whether the virus could be transmitted through cooked food. And I haven't seen any such indications. The San Francisco Chronicle reported, and the CDC has said that there is no evidence that food has been associated with the transmission of the virus. So I think as long as you are taking the precautions of washing your hands, you know, eating food that has been prepared in a restaurant shouldn't really be a concern with respect to direct transmission. Now, there was a separate question regarding whether folks, you know, ethically or morally should be carrying food out or ordering delivery. I think, you know, it's a really grippy question, one that certainly implicates health and safety and also economic considerations. On the one hand, by ordering takeout, are you putting yourself and workers at risk by ordering food out? On the other hand, are you doing some net good by supporting local businesses? And after doing a good deal of research on this, trying to find other qualified food writers who to speak on this, you know, I don't think there's a definitive take. I think the answer to those questions is a little bit of yes, and I think people really have to decide for themselves what level of risk they feel comfortable with. You know, I think there are restaurants that are observing all social distancing protocols. They're wearing masks in the kitchen, they're wearing gloves. And then there may not, you know, there may be some restaurants who aren't, where staff aren't, and more still, where restaurant owners can't afford to cease operations at this time. You know, it calls to mind the picture on this slide, which is of Vic's Chat, and Berkeleyside had, again, a really great story on restaurant owners locally that have chosen to stay open, and some of those animating reasons. So I'd encourage you to read that article, but essentially it says, you know, one of the testimonials from the owner says that, you know, this restaurant, usually thrumming with activity, very good in my personal opinion, now is only doing 20 to 30% of business. They may very well be losing money as a result, but they have decided to stay open because their employees wanted to continue working and wanted to be taking home money at this time. So I would say that if you don't feel comfortable with takeout or delivery, there are tons of other ways to support restaurants: merchandise, gift cards, donations, and meal kits, which we'll talk a little bit about in a second. But another component of the question pertained to whether it was morally proper, or, you know, the propriety of using delivery apps specifically, so Uber Eats, Caviar. And in that regard, I personally just call the restaurant directly if I decide to do takeout. And that way, the restaurant isn't charged a commission. Oftentimes, these commissions can range between 10 to 30% on the order, which can wipe out the restaurant's revenue. So I just call directly. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So what we can expect looking forward, and this harkens back to the first slide, and again, what other states have done as restaurants have been allowed to reopen in-room dining. You know, again, we got really great questions on how exactly restaurants will stay competitive in this new post-pandemic, or at least post-novel coronavirus world. I think in addition to, of course, following those protocols, it will be by fortifying a lot of the structural changes that entities are putting in place now. So beefing up takeout operations, even as restaurants reopen, takeout and delivery will be a centerpiece, because again, there will be, I think, a large swath of people who don't feel comfortable eating in dining rooms, even when you know, additional anticipated measures are taken. In, again, talking with Sarah, who is the editor of Nosh, she flagged, and I think Sarah's on this call, so please feel free to jump in at any time, but you know, she had a really interesting point that I wanted to share. Oh, sorry, you can go back to the last slide. Perfect. She had a really great point that I wanted to share with respect to carry out, which is that there have been some, you know, you could say relative success stories, and those have been typically businesses with strong takeout operations and lean staffing models, and that serve what one might think of as comfort food. So, you know, noodles, pizza, pasta, and those are certainly the things that I have gravitated toward at this time. And I think that that is a model, in addition to, you know, the carry out cocktail, or, you know, selling off wine that the restaurant has already amassed. I think that those are strategies like we will definitely continue to see. Quick service restaurants. I mean, that was a big trend even pre-COVID, and I think that's a trend that's only been fortified by the current crisis. Why? Because oftentimes these restaurants are able to function with fewer front of house staff, which means they have lower labor costs, and they often have mobility in mind. So they're kind of already geared towards that takeout kind of mindset. And again, they give customers the ability to customize, which is something that we know consumers like, and they're efficient. And so in Uptown alone, there's places like True Burger, Rico, and Eater San Francisco has reported that Nayum Bai, which is a nationally acclaimed Cambodian restaurant here in Oakland, will be reopening as a counter service restaurant. So I do think that is kind of a harbinger of what's to come. We're also going to see new concepts based on portability beyond takeout. Some people have been referring to this as kind of pandemic proofing, a concept that's related to takeout but has its own name, virtual kitchens. This was something that was on the rise again before COVID, and it probably will be even more prolific now. Virtual kitchens are defined as restaurants that don't operate a dining room but exist only for delivery. And so a good example of this, again, reported by Berkeleyside on April 24th, is a new concept by Chef Kyle Atani. He operates Atani Ramen and also is a co-owner of Hopscotch. This is called Nikai Sushi, and it is a takeout and delivery only restaurant that for now is operating out of Atani Ramen in Uptown Oakland, and the focus is on sushi rolls. He, in a press release, had mentioned to Berkeleyside that he wanted to give employment to sushi makers who are currently unemployed, and so that was one of the animating factors for opening now. The Humble Sandwich, which you may have heard about, is run by Fred and Liz Sasson, who own Homestead up on Piedmont Avenue. And though they're currently operational out of Homestead, they will continue to stay open, and they may reopen as a kind of a virtual kitchen that's accessible through third-party delivery apps during Homestead's normal dinner service when that resumes, according to the San Francisco Chronicle. Meal kits. So that has been a big thing, I think, to come out of COVID-19 that we weren't really seeing before. Sister on Grand Avenue, which again I mentioned is a personal favorite, is doing a sister box, and that's a portion for $4, it's $40, things like fresh pasta, vegetarian pasta sauce, cookies, granola, focaccia, olives, and nuts. It's like really a full deal. And that is available, I think, on Thursdays. And so that's a cool idea. Soba Ichi is another. Sarah just had a wonderful review, and it's where this picture is from. She wrote this review last week, and I'd encourage you to read it. I don't want to spoil it, but here's her picture of fresh soba noodles and dipping sauce. And online wine tasting. So I, didn't join in our cheers with my glass of wine. I'm saving that for post talk. We have been doing a pickup from Bay Grape here in Uptown, and they have really fun mixed packs of wine for actually a really, I think, affordable price. But online wine tastings I've seen at Vintage Berkeley. The wine buyer there, Dan, is like incredibly well-versed in really all things wine. And so what they're doing is like wine drop off, and then you can do a tasting with the winemakers. So I think that's a great idea and a great experience. Berkeley-based winemakers are also doing similar things. So Donkey and Goat, which recently made national news for their kind of like low intervention wine styles, just did a virtual wine and cheese party. And again, Instagram, I think, is a great way to keep track of that kind of stuff. Oh, I see I'm almost at 6:30, yikes. Okay, next slide, please. Let's just run quickly through kind of food adjacent industries. So food stores, farmers, and restaurant suppliers. If you've been to a grocery store recently, you've seen they are adapting. County provisions govern here again, including requirements that limit, for instance, item restrictions on goods that sell out quickly, beads, toilet paper. I'm sure you've seen other interesting items being limited. There's a prohibition on the use of reusable bags. And again, social distancing protocol must stand 6 feet apart. There are more options for home delivery. I wanted to also make mention of Instacart. Today, Eater reported that the company, it's a grocery delivery company for those who haven't heard of it, they just reported their first profit in the company's history, and it was the $10 million profit for April. So they in some ways have, I guess you could say, benefited from this changed nature of ordering. The company just hired 300,000 workers. They're seeking to hire another 250,000. And I think that's kind of, again, the kind of the new retail landscape that we face. There's also been a rise in corner stores serving community needs. Nosh is running an article series highlighting neighborhood markets throughout the Bay, which have seen a surge in popularity. I mean, anecdotally, I have been relying on my corner store far more to avoid lines at the grocery store. Small farmers and producers have been hit really hard beyond the kind of obvious disruptions to the economy. I think in part it is because sometimes we associate luxury goods with parties, and we can't have those now for the most part, and at least not ones in person. And also people just have less money to spend on artisanal products. And the crisis has really also created an urgency, I think, among small farmers to shift to direct-to-consumer relations through things like one-off farm boxes or by expanding CSA memberships. Farmers markets are still open. They too qualify as essential businesses, and they are taking many of the same precautions as food stores. But as a recent Berkeleyside article also pointed out, they are suffering from what is, I think, a unique challenge of a lack of out-of-town visitors. People bringing their friends and their parents who are visiting to the farmers market. I mean, here in Grand Lake, it's a huge, I think, attraction. And so that has been, I think that local producers have suffered as a consequence. Okay, last slide. Okay, hunger relief. So I know there was mention of Alameda County Community Food Bank, and I spoke with Michael Altfest, who's the Director of Communications there, for a recent article that I wrote on hunger relief efforts. And he drew this distinction about the kind of the architecture of hunger relief efforts now that I think has really been informative. I wanted to share it, which is the kind of among the distinctions among the major players. So food banks, you can think of like a big Costco warehouse type facility, and food banks provide goods to food pantries and soup kitchens. And this matters particularly now because so many food pantries where people can go to get a hot meal or grocery, they have been forced to shut down because they are primarily run by volunteers and staffed in particular by people over the age of 65. And so they've closed entirely, which has again shifted the burden back in many ways onto food banks. And they are at the same time facing unprecedented demands for food assistance. As more people get laid off or have hours reduced, I mean, people now are seeking food that don't really consider themselves as food insecure. So they might be making $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, and for the first time are relying on food assistance. So when I spoke with Michael at Alameda County Community Food Bank, and this was in late March, he has said that ACCFB had seen their numbers quintuple over the course of 2 days, and 50% of callers were first-time callers. And I also spoke with people at SF Marin Food Bank and at Second Harvest in Silicon Valley, and this is really pervasive across the Bay Area. And with respect to having to do more with less, they're also facing a whole host of social distancing restrictions. So like they cannot have people really in their warehouse to the extent that they could before. And so they're also having to pivot. And so one of the ways that they're pivoting is by assembling emergency food bags. And they're really interesting linkages with public school districts. So for instance, ACCFB made and delivered 3,000 food banks in, and this was 3 weeks ago, to 12 different school sites in Oakland. And I only mention it because their efforts have only continued and I'm sure grown in that time since I spoke with Michael. Just quickly, the role of restaurants in schools. Restaurants are pitching in by feeding first responders, the homeless, and other individuals disproportionately affected by the crisis. The team from Hopscotch, in conjunction with local writer Ayelet Waldman, are using donations to feed ER workers. You can follow them on East Bay Feeder. Restaurants now, I just thought this was an interesting point, can be reimbursed under a new statewide program that will pay local restaurants to provide hot meals to senior citizens. And that's a real win-win because seniors can stay home, they can have food delivered to them, and restaurants are getting reimbursed. Lastly, schools are playing a huge role providing no-cost meals to any child, person under the age of 18, and there's no proof of enrollment required. So these programs in place at like Berkeley Unified, Oakland Unified, and San Francisco Unified School Districts are providing tens of thousands of meals each week, again, in conjunction with food banks like ACCFB. And this picture is actually from staff at Edible Schoolyard, which is housed at King Middle School, dropping off lettuce to the Berkeley Food Network, which is a local pantry that has remained open. Okay, thank you so much. That was actually all I had. I wanted to make sure I got through it to answer any other questions. Hopefully it wasn't fast. Thanks.
Well, that was amazing. I do have some questions that came in through the chat. Let's see. I guess going off of the food bank, we actually had Oakland Uptown had a volunteer shift scheduled, and it got canceled recently, and there seems to be a need for help. How are food banks getting the work done to get food out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the particular food bank. So when I spoke with the CEO at Second Harvest in Silicon Valley, they were suffering from tremendous volunteer shortages, and their solution, at least initially, was to bring in paid part-time workers. And the way that they were, I guess, covering the cost of that was through donations. You know, a lot of this has been, a lot of the way that they're getting the work done is just by shifting the way that they distribute food. So whereas before, with Alameda County, the preferred way to distribute food was through the pantry network. Now with pantry shutting down, that's not really an option. And so what they're doing again is assembling these emergency food bags. You know, they do, I think that they are very cognizant of, you know, wanting to keep people safe, and that oftentimes will mean even if they need volunteers, they're going to probably rely on something like a bare bones staff because of, you know, the social distancing restrictions. I think that in view of these requirements, the best way to pitch in now is just donations. That's what was suggested to me by the folks at St. Anthony's, which is a nonprofit that operates in the Tenderloin, and they help you know, low-income homeless residents of San Francisco. So, I mean, that's what I've heard in that regard.
Oh, great. Some other questions that came in, I think, have any communities that are opening restaurants address people with disabilities, especially with the requirement of masks, and with people potentially relying on lip reading for communication, how that may pan out?
That's a really great question. I don't know if anyone, I haven't seen anything with respect to lip reading. I mean, I guess, yeah, I would encourage anyone to chime in if they've seen anything on that. I don't want to speak out of turn.
It seems like the mask requirement, this is Sarah, it seems like the mask requirement is so new that it's probably hasn't been addressed yet, but it might come up in the coming days. So that is a very interesting question.
Yeah. Okay. And then on a similar note, it's more on the sustainability side, especially with it being such a huge focus in Alameda County and in Berkeley, a couple of coffee shops. We saw Blue Bottle was starting to remove disposable cups at the beginning of the year, and there's a couple of other coffee shops throughout Oakland. Will we see a step back in sustainability efforts during this after post-COVID life, or is this a new opportunity for being sustainable?
Yeah, that's a tremendous question. You know, I think with respect to disposability, there have certainly been calls for things like disposable menus, and to the extent that patrons aren't allowed to use reusable bags. I mean, it's, I think one could certainly see, at least in the short term, a step backward with respect to those efforts. I mean, ideally in the long term, this is kind of a time for taking stock and implementing new models. You know, I think the other issue, of course, with takeout and delivery is that there are, you know, there's a lot more containerage around food than there is with dine-in service. Also with hunger relief efforts, like, you know, St. Anthony's, for instance, they used to, when they would feed, when they would give free meals, they would invite, you know, they would invite people into their dining room. And one situation they experienced, as well as ACCFB and SF Marine Food Bank, was just like a plastic bag shortage. And so I do think there's going to be a lot more kind of like single-use plastics perhaps being used, which is unfortunate. Hopefully that there is some longer-term sustainability measures. I don't know if anyone has heard of anything along those lines, but.
Okay. And it sounds like Sarah might be working on a story for that, so stay tuned on Berkeleyside. Okay, and then we have a question regarding high dining. As you know, the in-person dining experience is critical to that experience, and how do you see these types of restaurants adapting in the new post-COVID reality?
It's another great question. I mean, I have been really surprised by the pivots by what we might think of as like fine dining, you know, Michelin-starred restaurants that are doing these kinds of takeaway operations. For instance, like Lazy Bear in San Francisco, which is a 2 Michelin-starred restaurant. They kind of converted their dining room into like a commissary, and are doing kind of a takeaway menu. I just heard today about a restaurant in New York that's doing an $800 sushi box. So that is crazy, in my humble opinion. But yeah, so I think that this might become its own luxury dining economy. You know, I think among people who can afford that, maybe that'll be a kind of new conspicuous consumption. I wouldn't actually find that entirely surprising, but it sort of remains to be seen. Yeah.
And there was a question regarding, in relation to the farmers market slide, are there additional direct-to-consumer models by small farmers outside of the farmers market?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What I've heard is just kind of the CSA kind of model, so subscription model. I don't know, has anybody else heard of anything kind of like similar with direct to consumer?
Yeah, somebody came to the
Lisa?
What did you say? I've seen that there's someone who came and spoke at the Lake Mart Breakfast Club who has that kind of a business. I don't know how it's doing now, but it was about 1.5 years ago.
Yeah, I guess one other thing I might say, although this isn't really like farmers, but at least with small producers, I think that there have been some, you know, I'm thinking like bread makers, for instance, that are just going really direct to consumer, but via social media. So they're, you know, you can pick up essentially like at their home. I'm thinking like Oakland Bread Studio, and that I think is maybe a way that smaller producers are pivoting, is just really relying on social media.
I have something I'd like to share. First, there was something on NPR just saying how unfortunate it is that the supply chain is either meant for restaurants, cafeterias, or hotels, or the individual. So their machines for their pallets and all that can't quickly pivot to get you some butter, eggs, or even toilet paper, as Sue mentioned, with industrial toilet paper dispensers. And then Cheetah is this, I don't think you brought it up, but Cheetah is like a online supplier to restaurants. Someone in my building who knew someone there, I've now seen these Cheetah trucks around, is allowing individuals to order, well, it was going to be like a 5-pound bag of jasmine tea, but still, if you really love jasmine tea, and it was like, you know, a lot of ground beef or steak, if you think, you know, maybe you have several people in your household, you could support this Cheetah company, because they're pivoting because they don't have enough restaurant clients right now.
Yeah, definitely. That called to mind like Liberty Ducks. I think it's for the first time you can purchase those directly, and those are, you know, really. I haven't done it personally, but I have friends who've ordered those for the first time.
And I have a couple more. So food service has become a very high volume driven pricing model. Do you see this changing to set pricing that can accommodate less volume?
You know, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, it seems like something that could certainly happen. I haven't seen anything like that. I think that supply, you know, kind of like supply chains, pricing models are really going to be rethought. It's kind of, we're in that process now. It's certainly something I can see going forward.
Okay. I think you've answered this loosely regarding the sit-down dining experience, but do you think it'll become a luxury good or service that won't be accessible to most customers?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like, you know, with respect to Hong Kong, one thing that I read was there are still lines for certain like very coveted restaurants. And I can imagine that happening if especially there's going to be reduced capacity. So, you know, if there was a 50-person restaurant, now they can only seat 12 people. Like, yeah, I mean, I actually think there could be some kind of like greater jockeying. I mean, we might even see some, I mean, going back to the question about pricing, this is a little bit different, but like one thing we might see is actually pricing based on days. So like you know, eating at a restaurant might be more expensive on a Friday versus on a Tuesday. You know, there are some restaurants that are like Chez Panisse, for instance, like you can actually eat downstairs for, I think it's like $75 on Mondays, and every other night it's like 100 or 120. So I actually think that's something, given reduced occupancy, that we might see more and more.
Great. I think the only question I have is from Lise. Are you aware of the push by businesses to have Congress pass a law giving them immunity from opening up and increasing the risk of the spread of COVID-19?
Wait, sorry, can you repeat that one more time? I think I missed the beginning.
Oh, are you aware of the push by businesses to have Congress pass a law giving them immunity from opening up and increasing the risk of the spread of COVID-19?
I haven't heard that. You know, it was interesting. We had a question about liability for businesses, and so I don't know to the extent it pertains to this question, but I you know, the one thing that I thought of, or the two things I thought of, was one, I mean, there are certain things courts can do. So we've seen with respect to like meat packing plants that have seen an incidence of COVID cases because of like, you know, they weren't necessarily following restrictions. Courts can, for instance, like order them to follow those guidelines. But with respect to liability, I think it's like very difficult to ascribe kind of like liability to a particular business because of some like confounding factors that you may have actually gotten this somewhere else. And so I just like with tort theories of like negligence, I actually think it'd be very difficult for like there to be business liability. Now, if there was like a new law that changed that, of course, things would be different. But I was just thinking in terms of the status quo.
Okay. And then I think we can ask this last one, unless we have more come in. What type of international collaborations are currently taking place to support people that are now lacking food aid as a result of reduced funding in the humanitarian sector?
That's a really good question. I do not have my finger on the pulse of international food relief efforts now. Has anyone seen anything like that? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Difficult one.
Good question.
And I guess, do you think the industry will bounce back quickly? Joe, do you have a specific timeline with regards to your question? Oh, Joe's muted.
Okay.
Well, it's tough. Yeah, because,
It's a multi-part question or answer,
yeah.
probably.
Well, quickly is hard. I think the real problem right now, as in most factor aspects of our lives, is just the ambiguity. And so I think bouncing back, I think the main preoccupation is having a set of guidelines that restaurants that are clear, that can be implemented. And I think in the absence of that, it's going to be really tough to bounce back because there's just too much uncertainty for business owners. And I think a lot of it's also going to depend on the proclivity of the dining public for re-entering restaurants. I think if diners don't feel comfortable, then they're going to continue only with takeout and delivery. And so that's just more of the same. And so there has to be, I think, enough consumer confidence that the crisis is being managed correctly. So, there's so many factors at play, but I hope so. I do.
Great. I think that's all the questions I got in the chat. Should we open it up or?
Yeah, we can open it up if anybody has anything more. We probably have room for one or two more questions.
Oh, just ask?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, just go ahead and ask.
What do you think, given that San Francisco's largest union is the Restaurant Workers Union, and Oakland has a lot of restaurants as well, it looks like the permanent effect of this is going to be depressed employment because there are a lot fewer people employed in the takeout business. Is that what you think is going to happen?
I'm sorry, my internet cut out right at the beginning of your question. Sorry, you were saying that, so the union is really big, and I missed, sorry, what came after that?
A lot of people are employed in the restaurant businesses today, or have been. Looking to the future, if it's more takeout, it seems like that's going to have a long-term depressing effect on employment in the industry in this area, San Francisco and Oakland. Is that your take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think with takeout and delivery, you just need fewer hands. I mean, you can really reduce your front of house team. And I think that there will be long-term structural changes in that direction, even if they are not required. I mean, definitely seeing that with respect to the shift towards counter service, which was like a trend pre-existing, and I think will only be more prevalent. And then the only other thing I'd add is, especially if there's these half or 25% capacity rules, that's also going to have a long-term depressing effect on employment prospects. So yes, I definitely think so.
Thank you.
We have time for one more if there's a question out there.
Secondary to the impact on restaurants, how is COVID going to impact the restaurant journalism business?
It's a great question. So many thoughts. As a freelance writer, and I mean, Berkeleyside is tremendous, and actually not and kind of entirely excluding them, but other articles that I've had that I wrote pre-COVID, and they're no fault of those outlets, but just because of the changed circumstances, those articles just like aren't relevant. You know, they're not relevant because everything is so different. And so those articles, of course, have to be tweaked. They have to be rewritten. And you know, I mean, in the grand scale of problems, that's not a large one, but you know, it is a lot of work. And you know, even beyond just food journalism, I mean, any nonfiction journalism about economics, about politics. Like if you had a book coming out right now, like it just, my heart in some ways goes out for those writers. And you know, sorry?
Like a certain someone we know. Lise is writing a book.
Question for all of us, what's the best place to look for the list of restaurants that are open that we can get takeout from? So that we can support them during this time.
Absolutely. I mean, Berkeleyside, like I said, they have multiple really good interfaces, but they also have like a separate kind of whole kind of page for just like searching in the East Bay. And if Sarah's still on the call, she can like give more information about that too. But they're wonderful for the East Bay. So I go there.
I'll share the link in the chat.
Oh, great.
Great, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
And Kathryn, thank you so much for giving us talk. It was fantastic. Getting your wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Bon appetit.
Rotary.